Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Darina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. In a post-COVID world, families are asking harder questions about vaccines, and those questions deserve serious ethical answers. My guest today is Jay Richards, Vice President of Social and Domestic Policy and the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles and Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where he also chairs the Restoring American Wellness Initiative. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute. In this episode, we take on some of the most difficult questions families face today: how to think clearly and ethically about vaccines, informed consent, risk, the updated CDC childhood immunization schedule, and what it means to rebuild public trust in institutions. This is a conversation for parents, professionals, and anyone navigating vaccine decisions with both reason and conscience. Jay, welcome to the show.
Marina, great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So, Jay, what personal or professional experiences led you to focus your policy work on human dignity, and how did that lens shape the issues which we are engaging?
Well, honestly, if somebody sort of Googles my name, they'll see I've written on lots of different topics. I basically a philosopher by trade, but really a shameless generalist. I like translating uh, ideas from the academic world into general audiences, and have been interested in the way in which this kind of fundamental cluster of truths about the truth about the human person, that we have this intrinsic value and dignity as creatures made in the image of God, that grounds the Declaration of Independence. It grounds what ought to be things like international law. And I think it's actually a really helpful sort of explanatory filter for analyzing lots of issues. But I only really got interested in things like vaccines and public health in general, honestly, which is a kind of an entire area I was unaware of. It was really the COVID event starting in 2020 that alerted me to a series of problems with what we might call it the biomedical security state, which is what Aaron Kheriaty calls it. It's a perfect name, but something that lots of people, maybe activists for medical freedom or vaccine activists, were acutely aware of for their own particular reasons for years. And it wasn't until 2020 that we really saw the full power and the fangs, if you will, of the global public health apparatus and the frankly kind of totalitarian instincts that it had. And that woke me up first to just that okay, what is this public health thing? Why is it that if people are told, okay, there's a virus, suddenly mass gets canceled in your local parish and people have to stay home and can't do their jobs? So I realized this is an incredibly powerful but also dangerous tool for social control. And then as things wore on, of course, during 2020, I and some friends very quickly realized the lockdowns were completely idiotic. They made no sense to prevent the spread of a respiratory virus. And so a couple of friends, including one that was a longtime friend and colleague at the Discovery Institute, Doug Axe, and a statistician friend named William Briggs, believe it or not, in March of 2020, so just about the time the lockdown started, we looked into this. We looked into the computer model that had been developed by a guy named Neil Ferguson at Imperial College London with his team, that the World Health Organization and NIH in the United States were just believing. They thought, okay, well, there's this massive infection fatality rate. I think they came up with a number like 3.7%, which would have been a total catastrophe. And that was guiding public health. And Briggs and I actually knew Ferguson because we knew for 20 years he has been developing these predictive models for various pandemics, and he gets it wrong 100% of the time, and he always gets it wrong in a particular direction. So rather than saying, "Oh, don't worry, this disease isn't a problem, no one will die," he always says, "Okay, there's a bird flu, hundreds of millions of people are going to die." Always sort of overpromised, and we knew that anybody that knows about statistical modeling knows that it basically tell you what you told them to tell you. You put in variables and it runs simulations. And so it's not sort of a surprise and all that insightful, even unless you kind of know the real variables to plug in. Ferguson and his team at Imperial College London, I mean, just basically made up the variables. They made up numbers. And so we were just absolutely certain this was going to be a catastrophe. However bad the virus was, the lockdowns were going to make no sense. And by, I think, April the 1st of 2020, we had a book contract with Regnery Publishing to deliver a book that year on the insanity of the lockdowns. It was called The Price of Panic. It came out in October of 2020. It was the first book on the subject. Only possible because the three of us were basically locked down and didn't have to go anywhere, didn't have to put pants on, and could just sort of obsessively write a book. But the long and the short of it is by June, we had all the statistical evidence we needed to show that whether you look at US states or look at individual countries, lockdowns made no discernible difference at all in the spread of the virus. If you look at the kind of the curves of infection, you'd never be able to guess where the lockdown happened because it made no discernible difference. And so then, that honestly kind of made me much, much more skeptical of public health bureaucracies and agencies than I was before. I mean, I'm a conservative. Know about public choice economics. I know about how incentives can be distorted in large government bureaucracies. I didn't know how bad the public health bureaucracy had become. But that book was about the lockdowns. It wasn't about vaccines. In fact, it was out before the vaccines came online. And then all of a sudden, if everyone remembers December of 2020, January of 2021, we had these vaccines that came online. They had been developed very quickly. There was at least one that was available that was a kind of a conventional vaccine, and then a couple that were these new mRNA therapies or interventions that were really fundamentally different type of technology. I initially just thought, well, okay, I actually got COVID in November of 2020, so I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to get the vaccine. Didn't. My wife and I started talking about, okay, what's the ethical background of these vaccines? We looked at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which does a great job of telling you, okay, which ones of these have aborted fetal cell lines, at least maybe in the testing, which were less tainted in that way. That's what we were thinking about. And then once the mandates kicked in Washington, D.C., they kicked in a lot of places. We had to have this vaccine passport. That's when I thought, okay, that's weird, right? Why would you make somebody that just had COVID get a vaccine? And so that was honestly the thing that sort of triggered my skepticism that, okay, something more is going on here. Even though I didn't know much right about this sort of technology or the details, but I just knew it made no sense to force someone at pain of exile and losing their job to take a quickly developed and released vaccine for something for which they had just had the illness. And so that was a sort of what initiated my kind of more skeptical look at these things. But Irina, actually, the really big thing when it came to the CDC vaccination schedule was my daughter, who got married, got pregnant, and had friends talking about the CDC vaccination schedule and how big it was and all these things. And so she asked me, said, "Dad, would you sort of look into this?" She knew that, I have this tendency, if I get interested in something, I'll kind of obsess on it for a year, and really dig deep. And I honestly didn't want to do it. I was a little afraid of what I would find if I studied this issue, but finally I did. And it's one of these topics where, there's lots of things we maybe have an opinion on, but then somebody will press us, okay, have you really done research? And sometimes you do research and you discover, oh no, I was just completely clueless about this. I had been propagandized and didn't know what I was talking about. Other times you look into something and it confirms kind of what you thought. So it gives you greater confidence. Unfortunately, looking at the way the vaccine schedule is developed, the sort of details of the testing, it just made me more and more concerned about the sort of the wisdom of this thing overall. It didn't make me some philosophical anti-vaxxer or anything like that, but it made me realize how complex the situation is and how ridiculous and oversimplistic the public health marketing of this had been. And then, lo and behold, of course, with the election of Donald Trump and RFK Jr. as the HHS secretary, this is a lot more people are obviously aware of it than they were. But that's kind of the backstory for me. Obviously, not a physician, but I know how to read scientific papers and I know how to use logic and cost benefit analysis. And so that's a lot of kind of personal details that sort of led me into this.
No, thank you for sharing that, and that's some really good context. Obviously, I think a lot of us started questioning, especially about the mandates, as
Hmm.
you mentioned, about the COVID-19 mandates, and even your own freedom to choose whether or not to have them at the pain of losing your job or other benefits that you have in society. We will talk about the updated CDC vaccine
Yeah.
schedule, but before we get into any specifics, I wanted to ask you about what principles you think should guide vaccine
Hmm.
conversations if they're going to be worthy of public trust.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is sort of truthfulness because of what we discovered during COVID is that the kind of public health logic is different from Hippocratic logic. Hippocratic logic is, of course, a physician is to first do no harm. So, in other words, the fundamental guiding principle of the physician under the sort of Hippocratic medicine is the good of your individual patient. It's not some abstract social good. It's the good of your patient that's right there with you. That's not true for public health. Public health uh, frankly treats individuals as statistical units. And so what they're looking for is okay, in the aggregate, if we ignore people's particular situations and their freedom of choice and all that, what do we think would be the best thing overall for, say, reducing the spread of a particular respiratory virus? And then the individual just gets abstracted out. And so if you think that way, then you're going to be much more likely to think, okay, what kind of behavioral tweaks and social engineering can we engage in order to get people to comply with what we want them to do? And so, well, if we want everyone or almost everyone to get a particular vaccine, then what we should do is terrify them, right? That they're going to die and they're going to kill their children are going to die or they're going to kill their grandparents if they don't get this vaccine because that's fear is a really strong motivator. And so there's already this very strong incentive in public health to just kind of exaggerate and misrepresent the truth. And so I think honestly, if public health officials or Paul Offit or whoever is upset by increased vaccine skepticism among the public, they have only themselves to blame. And if they want to reverse that, they need to start telling the truth. And that means they need to tell people about the genuine benefits and risks of individual vaccines, of a cumulative set of vaccines, admit its limits, admit circumstances in which it might not make sense, and just quit speaking in this kind of ridiculous and propagandistic way. That's the key thing: is truthfulness about risk reward, benefits and limits, proportionality then to individual risk. So in other words, some people are going to be at higher risk of a particular disease than others. And so unless the vaccine is zero risk, which it never is, there's no medical intervention probably that has zero risk, you have to be able to balance those things. And if you're at almost no risk of getting a disease, or even if you are, it's very unlikely to have a negative outcome, then it makes perfect sense that you should rationally have less desire to get the vaccine than otherwise. And all of this is really an absolute prerequisite for Hippocratic medicine. That is informed consent. It is a kind of foundation bioethically. In other words, people have to consent, so they can't be forced to do something. They have to respect their agency. And really, to be able to do that, though, they need to be properly informed. And so if somebody feels like, okay, well, I chose properly, but my doctor didn't really tell me the truth, or he didn't take the time to help explain it, then you didn't have informed consent. And that's a distortion of a doctor-patient relationship. And then honestly, the public health authorities need more humility and they need more openness to scrutiny. The effect of calling everyone who asks these questions an anti-vaxxer is that they're just going to dilute the term. And then at some point, people aren't going to care. And so they need to accept their responsibility for creating this crisis and do the opposite of what they've been doing if they want to regain our trust.
Absolutely. And for example, I I thought it was ridiculous that people, they would ask people to wear masks going
Uh-huh.
into a restaurant, and then as soon as you sat down, you could take it off, as if as if germs traveled at only in certain heights and not
Yes.
other. It didn't make any sense, right? It
No,
doesn't make actual scientific sense to do
not at all.
that. And so, how can you continue to have trust in institutions that are spreading those kinds of rules that are
Mhm.
really arbitrary, and don't actually protect people?
Obviously so, right? You didn't need to look at, okay, if there've been randomized control trials about the spread of, respiratory viruses in the air, because obviously, okay, however it goes, it's going to spread when you're walking, it's going to be spread when you're sitting, and this kind of COVID theater, right? That I was surprised, honestly, how many people fell for it. But if you're just sort of have slight detachment from the situation, you realize, okay, this is absurd.
Mhm. So, when people encounter conflicting claims about vaccines,
Mhm.
how should they think about evaluating evidence and credibility?
So, I always think, okay, what is there something that people can do if they haven't studied the issue at all, right? Like, is there some way you can figure out based on the situation where you could decide what's rational without actually going and doing a deep dive right into the literature. But I mean, here's the kind of key things I would say parents should ask, or at least consider, and they can ask their doctor, right? What's my child's actual disease risk? So not statistical abstraction. What's the risk that my child right now in his or her situation is at serious risk from this disease, catching it or serious outcome or death, right? Those are just different things. How strong is the evidence behind the shot? That is, how strong is the evidence that it's actually effective? What are the rare adverse events? We have this at the moment passive database effectively called VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Recording System, I believe is what VAERS stands for, in which doctors and people they can post adverse events from a vaccine from their patient. So, what about it? What are even in VAERS, even though it's somewhat unreliable, we think it only captures between 1 and 10% of actual vaccine adverse events or injuries. But they vary. It's not like the vaccines are all the same. Some have much more adverse events than others. Can I space or defer doses? So in other words, there's the question of whether you should do something, but also the question of when you should do it. And if it's okay if it's a multi-dose sort of regimen, can you space it out? And then are there ethical concerns? That's straightforward ethical concerns that can certainly include things like the use of fetal tissue or fetal cell lines, in testing or in the actual product. That's a kind of crucial question. But the really fundamental ethical question, if you're a parent, it's one thing if somebody says, I want you to take an individual risk for a social good, right? So I want to give you something and it's puts you at slight risk, but it will prevent or reduce the likelihood you'll spread a sickness to someone else that could be really harmed. I think in general, if it, that can often be the thing we ought to do. We ought to be willing in ourselves as adults to bear some risk for social good. As parents, we do not have the right, and we certainly don't have the responsibility to say, I'm going to put my child at risk for some abstract social benefit for other people. That doesn't make sense as a custodian of your child and his or her well-being. And so what you want to know is the well-being of the child, and you ask the cost benefit there. You don't think of your child as a disease vector that everybody needs to be protected from. And I think once that clicks in parents' minds, a lot of things click into place. Now, parents often think that they're having their child receive a vaccine for that child's protection, but if pressed, and the parent has done some reading and says, okay, hepatitis B, day one of birth, my child is at no risk of this. You as the mother have been tested. You're hepatitis B negative. That makes no sense. And then you press them, and then they say, well, but it helps, if everybody does it at birth, then that sort of benefits other people. So in other words, on the day your child is born, you're going to jab him or her with a vaccine with an antigen and an amplifier called an adjuvant, because somebody somewhere who's an intravenous drug user 30 years from now might have a slightly lower risk of contracting hepatitis B because your child got the shot on day one. That's just nutty. And anybody that once they realize, okay, is that the risk reward calculation? I mean, it's obvious it really doesn't make any sense to do it under those circumstances. But no, what's happened, they'd like us to believe that we're doing this for our own benefit. And also there's a social benefit. If pressed, they'll usually say, okay, maybe there's a risk to you, but you need to do it for your kind of moral obligation, which has some force, I think, for us as adults and individuals, far less force when we're having to decide kind of a proxy vote for our child. That's a serious, serious moral and religious liberty question when we're doing these things as custodians of our children.
Why do you think that parents are often dismissed too quickly just by asking questions? They just
Mhm.
want to know, as you mentioned, the risk benefit analysis and all of that, all that's
Yeah.
involved with vaccines. Why are they dismissed?
Well, I honestly, I think the public health methodology for decades has encouraged that, so that if anyone raises a question, they're a conspiracy theorist who's picking up crazy stuff off the internet. And of course, there are all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories on the internet, so that's certainly true. But it doesn't follow that there's, everything is fine with the CDC vaccine schedule. And so I think a lot of it is that doctors, many of them, just think, okay, these people are cranks. They don't really know what they're talking about. They haven't gone to medical school. How do they know? And so they feel like they sort of developed a series of strategies to try to get parents to comply that doesn't involve a long, complicated conversation about the costs and benefits of every one of these vaccines. And then, as many people I'm sure have heard, there are incentives in place for doctors groups. You might have a pediatric doctors group which has an incentive as a part of their group to try to, the, increase the percentage of their patient base that's fully vaccinated, so that they have, rather than again thinking about the individual benefit to the patient, they're thinking about, okay, how do I get as many of my patients fully vaccinated so that I can get some kind of bonus or something like that? So there's these kind of perverse incentives, unfortunately, and that just has led to a really crazy situation. I mean, the truth of the matter is that most parents don't have the time or inclination to, to read Turtles All the Way Down, or even, Dr. Robert Sears' vaccine book, or anything like this, and so they may not even quite know the questions to be asked. But look, if we're supposed to trust our doctors and our pediatricians with these things, then just ask a couple questions to see if they have any idea what they're talking about. Because I hate to say it, I have many friends that are pediatricians. They're busy. They're not checking PubMed every morning and looking to follow the studies. And so just ask them, okay, what outcome was measured in the studies that led to the approval of this drug? What's the comparator? In other words, what are we comparing it to? How was the study designed? Were there genuine neutral placebos in the original trial? What kind of data do we have about adverse events? Are there active studies, right, versus just these passive systems like VAERS? And then you just start talking about these things, and then ask them, okay, why do you think the vaccine schedule had started to grow so dramatically after 1986? And just see what they say, right? If they are able to answer satisfactorily, that will tell you that, okay, they have actually looked into this, and so they're probably more trustworthy on this question. If they dismiss you or fire you or clearly don't know the answer, then that means they probably haven't done any more research than you have on the subject. And that's very hard for people to get their minds around. The answer, by the way, to the 1986 question is that 1986 is when the federal government gave vaccine manufacturers liability protection, so a shield from liability. So in other words, unless fraud is involved, vaccine companies in the US cannot be sued by people who are injured by their vaccines by law. And so, of course, if that's true, that kind of messes up the incentives that vaccine companies have for making sure that their drugs are as safe or their vaccines are as safe and effective as possible. And so it's no surprise that you had just a few vaccines prior to 1986, and then all of a sudden, after the manufacturers got this liability protection legally, all of a sudden a bunch of new vaccines entered the schedule, unfortunately. That's just, I mean, that took me just a couple of minutes to describe, but if parents can just even learn those, and then they don't even have to know the detailed right answer, but just see, okay, does my doctor have some satisfactory answers? Is he or she know anything about this or not? I know it's flabbergasting, but some doctors are amazing and study this stuff. Others are, they're just working hard, and it's like they're on a treadmill, and they honestly, they haven't really looked into this at all.
Wow, that's fascinating, and it's really good to know because it's hard to trust the pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, when you know that there's an incentive and there's no liability. So that's a really good point for our listeners to know. So, how should parents weigh the risks and the benefits, whether neither vaccinating
Hmm.
nor not vaccinating? Because obviously, there's risks if you vaccinate,
Yep,
there are risks if you don't
that's
vaccinate.
right.
So, nothing is risk free, as you said. How
Hmm.
should they weigh the risks and the benefits?
Okay, so this is a painful question for me, and the reason is that when I first started studying this issue, I had imagined, okay, I'm gonna have this amazing document that I'm gonna create, and it's gonna rank all the vaccines on the CDC childhood vaccination schedule. It's gonna rank them from the least risky, most beneficial to the most risky, least beneficial, right? So in other words, the ones you wouldn't probably want to do, except under very strange circumstances, and then the ones that make sense that you should do or administer. I've never been able to do that, and the reason is because it depends upon the individual. It depends upon your station in life. Are you a child who's just been born and your mother has hepatitis B? That's totally different, right? You're at high risk of hepatitis B in that circumstance. Now, whether you should get a shot on day one or not, maybe that's an open question. But it would make more sense for a child like that to receive a hepatitis B vaccine than for a child who's at zero risk. And so that's a kind of easy case. But this is true with virtually every vaccine. What environment do you live in? What latitude are you at? What sort of pre-existing health problems do you have, or that your family might have? So there's no super easy answer about this. I do think that some of these things, and this is just my opinion, I'm not giving doctors advice, obviously, but a lot of the really tragic vaccine injuries, or at least reported vaccine injuries that I've heard about and have studied, tend to happen when children are vaccinated under age 3. So that a vaccine that might be associated with a serious injury very young isn't associated with the disease much as the child gets older. This is kind of common sense. And this is part of the problem, is that the idea is that we're going to just jam all of these vaccines into children really, really early. And I mean, I've got close personal friends, people you know too, and I'm sure you have friends who've literally been fired by their pediatrician simply because they said, I want to space this out more and I want to start them a little later. That is an outrageous situation and is not conducive to trusting medicine, to basically be fired from your doctor because you wanted to exercise some informed consent. And so the good news is that under Secretary Kennedy, there's been a move underway, including these very recent reforms, to just try to separate these things. And so, okay, the CDC is going to continue recommending these particular vaccines. Others, they say, should really be up to you, or essentially between you and your doctor, and you can sort of talk through those things. That's a much healthier way of doing that. Now, my own view is that that's how the entire CDC vaccination schedule should be, and that they should do a better job of giving us all kind of a risk reward ranking. Though, as I said, it's really hard to do that because basically every single person, you would need a personalized sort of risk reward chart with all the vaccines for your particular situation. And, of course, we're not nearly sophisticated enough in our medicine to be able to do that. And so that's why I tend to focus on general principles rather than, if somebody asks me, should I get the MMR vaccine? Should my child get the MMR vaccine? It's like, okay, well, let's study that one in particular. The reality is that this is also a parent's rights and responsibilities question. We assume parents have the right and the responsibility to oversee their child's upbringing, their religion, their education, their diet, and their medical care. That's an awesome responsibility that we properly recognize parents have. And so don't let somebody else take that responsibility from you, but take the time to study this at least well enough to understand that, okay, this is a kind of a complex situation. And if you have a physician that wants to flatten that out and pretend that it's not a complex question, find another doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a super important point. We do want to just go over, as you mentioned, both the
Mm,
benefits and the risks so that our listeners, and just generally, we don't have to go through each
sure.
vaccine, but
Yeah.
generally, what are the real evidence based benefits of
Mhm.
vaccines?
Well, and let's get clear on what is a vaccine is in our heads. So most people, when you ask them what a vaccine is, they say, well, it's something that you get that produces a kind of artificial immune response, but in a less dangerous way, that then confers immunity on you so that you don't get the disease later and you don't transmit the disease later, right? And so that picture, as long as you assume that, you're going to say, gosh, yeah, maybe I'm willing to take the risk myself, but do I want to be a disease vector that spreads it to someone else is more vulnerable to a serious outcome? Unfortunately, there are just very few vaccines that actually work that way. I mean, we all became aware of this with the COVID vaccines, in which it's like every few months, apparently, you're supposed to be getting a booster. And so what it tells you is that in that case, it doesn't last very long. It also turns out it doesn't prevent infection, as we discovered. You can still it probably reduces, for people who don't have an adverse reaction, it probably reduces the severity of their symptoms with the COVID vax. It doesn't prevent you from catching it. It doesn't prevent you from transmitting it. In fact, ironically, by reducing the symptoms, you can be walking around and actually spreading it and not know it because you don't really feel the effects of the infection. And so once you realize that there's few vaccines that are really this kind of platonic ideal that give you lifelong immunity and protection from the disease and prevent you from spreading it to others. Once you realize that isn't how most vaccines actually work. They're not anywhere near that ideal. It does make it more complicated to talk about the benefits. Now, a lot of the benefits, if you just take COVID as an example, as I said, it does seem, especially for high risk groups, to reduce the severity of infection, at least, if you get infected soon after getting the shot. Well, that's a quite modest thing. And so it makes sense that if you're young and can look and see that, it's a very low risk of a really bad outcome if you're young and fit, that you're just not going to get that, right? Because the argument that it's going to help other people is so weak, and the argument that it's going to help you is actually weak, right? Then there's this complicated thing in that vaccine manufacturers combine vaccines like MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, in which you have multiple antigens from different pathogens jammed into one shot. Now, this isn't clinically necessary. It's done because it simplifies things. It's easier for people to get multiple sort of vaccines, essentially, all bundled together. They're more likely to do it. It's less work for the doctors. It's fewer trips to the doctor. And so they bundle these things. The problem is that they're bundling apples and oranges, because some things might be more risky and more concerning than other things that are in this bundle. So that people just, if they really, you want to get, vaccinated for mumps, it's like, okay, give me the mumps vaccine or measles. They bundle them together. And so it's like they found a way to make this an impossible statistical question for the ordinary person. And so I would say, of course, like polio and smallpox are the stories that all of us grew up with, in which, at least kind of the general story is that there's a catastrophic there were smallpox epidemics, and people who caught smallpox, at least at one time, is like a third of people that caught it would die of smallpox. So it was very serious. It was very infectious. And then, of course, polio, which in some ways is sort of closer to home. It's more recent. This, potential for a particular type of paralysis and your lower limbs. And so we look around and we don't meet people with polio. We don't meet people certainly, with smallpox. And so those seem, okay, that's how vaccines work. I don't even want to challenge the official story. It is more complicated than that. But even if that's the case, right, what's happening is that public health has used prestige laundering from the polio and smallpox cases and used it to give, sort of credibility and glory to vaccines that are actually much, much more modest in their effects. And so, for me, the pneumococcal vaccines, for instance, so I've had pneumonia 3 times. The second time I had pneumonia, it led to very serious complications. It led to pleural effusion and 2 weeks in the hospital and surgery, just really a bad thing. And so I'm sort of at higher risk of pneumonia when I get a cold. And so I'm willing to do that as an adult. I've learned it only sort of lasts for about 6 years, but the risk of me getting pneumonia is so high that it makes sense. That's true with every one of these. But, insofar as you can sort of move the things later, if you don't have time to study the individual things, I think it's generally a good idea. I'm not saying that as a medical advisor. I'm saying that just as somebody that studied the details. That at the very least, the later you administer these vaccines on the childhood schedule, it looks like the less likely there is to be an adverse outcome from the vaccines. Now, of course, what you're doing is you're assuming more risk. Assume some of those vaccines would help your child have far less severe symptoms. And so if you forego them for a while, you're subjecting your child to that risk. And so that's the absolute key thing. There are no zero risk options. And so you're just weighing the risks on all sides, given the moment and the time, the stage of your child's life, and the particular risks in your situation.
I think that's super helpful. You were talking about how the vaccines are bundled together.
Mhm.
Is there a way that you can get individual vaccines, or are some just bundled and you can only get the bundled versions in the US?
Just bundled. I mean, that's the crazy thing. This isn't true necessarily in Europe. They do these things differently. And it's not a manufacturing issue. There's no technical reason that we couldn't do this. And I do think as more and more parents educate themselves and are just more resistant to, standard operating procedure on this, that there will be market pressure for companies to unbundle these. And so I'm hoping that happens, because it basically makes it harder for people to make decisions about individual vaccines. The reason is because they don't want us making decisions about individual vaccines. They want us to just comply with the whole schedule and not ask any questions. But at some point, enough people are asking questions, and you can't just marginalize and dismiss them. That there's a kind of market effect to that. Okay, you want more uptake in that vaccine? Unbundle the darn thing. But at the moment, there's, I think, MMR and I think DTaP. I'm not positive. They're different diseases or different antigens bundled together that could be done individually but just aren't.
Hmm. And now moving on to the risks, are there specific vaccines that carry more risks than others? And how should parents think about that variability?
Yeah, I mean, you could sort of go through all of these. I mean, the one I think I'll mention it would be actually the COVID vax. So, and the mRNA vaccine itself. Now, I'll just give my opinion. I do not think those mRNA vaccines should be on the market. I think we know more than enough about them. We know that kind of everything they told us about them, and that they'd be quite effective, that they would stay in the injection site, they wouldn't have these kind of weird consequences. None of that proved to be true. And we have other non-mRNA vaccines, and these are gene therapies in which you're just they give you an injection that trains some cells in your body to produce the spike protein, which is one of the, I guess, the antigens that's on the COVID virus. And so this isn't injecting you with an antigen and then creating an immune response. This is injecting you with something that produces the thing to which your body needs to mount an immune response. And so, just kind of commonsensically, it sounds like, well, gosh, that's a kind of setting up an autoimmune scenario because your body's literally reacting to something your cells are producing. Um, and unlike, I seem to recall that we were told that this only happened for about 72 hours and then the activity dissipated, but we're now finding spike proteins, in all other parts of people's bodies, maybe a year or so in some cases
Hmm.
after they've been injected. And so that's the really big one. And the problem is that, if you're going to do the COVID vaccine, it's like people will hear numbers about, okay, how many shots will my child actually have to receive if I fully comply with the schedule from birth till he or she reaches 18. And you can include a few of the vaccines that the mom is encouraged to get while she's pregnant. It's approximately 72. It can be a little
Wow.
less than that or more, but it's because it depends on which brand in some cases. So in some brands, you get 2 doses spread out or 3 doses, but roughly 72. But you're including also in that basically annual flu shots and then COVID shots and boosters. I do not know, honestly, I do not know why any parent gives an otherwise healthy child an mRNA vaccine for COVID because the child is at extremely low risk. And the best thing you can say is that this is very new and experimental medical intervention. It's an experimental medical intervention that was rushed to the market, and we already know has all sorts of adverse events. And so, if you just decide, look, I'm going to forego that, and I don't know about the flu vaccine, you've already reduced the sort of load. Then you delay a few, and maybe you just drop a few that you just don't think that your child has a high risk of. That's going to be that's a lot safer, at least with respect to the risks from the vaccines, than if you just complied with the whole schedule without asking any questions. Again, you would be assuming another kind of risk, but that's always the question. Where does the risk of one decision versus the other lie?
Right. You've already mentioned this book, and I'll hold it up for our viewers, Turtles All the Way Down,
Yeah.
Vaccine, Science, and Myth, and that this book influenced your thinking.
Mhm.
What was your biggest takeaway from the book?
Well, it's so funny because that's not the first book I read on the subject. The first book I read was Dr. Robert Sears' vaccine book, which is very modest and mild in its description. It just goes through the schedule. His book has gone through several editions. I highly recommend it. It's not frightening. It's designed to help parents be able to make more informed decisions. And so I really needed something like that because I was not especially skeptical of vaccines in general when I started looking into this. And so I needed a book like that. It's kind of an on-ramp. Somewhere in maybe 3 or 4 or 5 books in, I heard about this book, Turtles All the Way Down, and read it. And the authors are anonymous, so I understand that they are scientists somewhere in industry and obviously experts, but are still plugged into the industry and didn't want to be outed. So it's written by an anonymous, but it's an unbelievable book because it goes through all the vaccines. It gives background on the trials that were conducted in order for the vaccines to be approved. Just so many methodological critiques about the way that studies are designed and set up to sort of give the desired outcome. I mean, I think most people know that these studies are done by the drug companies themselves who are going to profit from the drug if it's approved. The limits to the passive surveillance systems like theirs, the just consistent lack of transparency about the details of clinical trials. People are aware of that because of all this redacted data from the Pfizer and Moderna trials with the mRNA vaccines. I would say the thing that probably surprised me the most, maybe I already knew it, but it really hit home when I read Turtles All the Way Down, is that the current vaccines on the childhood vaccination schedule were not tested against non-inert placebos. I mean, that's just a basic rule. If you're going to do an objective trial, ideally it's a randomized control trial in which you have an experimental and a control group. So in other words, you're testing this. We're going to give one group of people the regular vaccine in this case, right, which is not only the antigen, it includes in lots of the ingredients, chief among them perhaps usually aluminum as an adjuvant, which an adjuvant just means that in this case it's put in to boost the immune response so that the person gets more of an immune response from the antigen than he or she would otherwise. Right, so all of those things are in there, and so then you would test it against an inert placebo. So in other words, what is actually done is that they're not an inert placebo. Now, what would that be? It would be something like saline, right? Which is just benign, and you can inject someone with it. And then you know that you're really testing the thing you want to test. But if you look into this, what you will discover inevitably is that they're usually tested either against the prior version of the vaccine or against some solution that includes the adjuvant. And so it's not really inert because there's separate questions about the effects and the risks of the aluminum that is the adjuvant itself. And let's say there is a risk to the aluminum salts, right, that are put into the vaccines. And that's a risk independent of, whether you've got this, the sort of a bit of the pathogen involved. You don't want to know that. But if that's a high risk, well, it's in both the control group and the experimental group. And so you're going to mask the actual dangers. And they do this over and over and over again. And there was a congressional hearing a few months ago with Aaron Siri, a really smart lawyer who litigates these things, and a medical scientist from Stanford, I believe. And he insisted that no, all of these, he gave some number about how many different studies there had been and how well tested these were, and that these were all tested against true placebos. Aaron Siri had committed to memory every one of these studies and pointed out that it just was not true. And so there's a massive propaganda campaign to try to get people to believe that, oh no, they were properly tested, when in fact they weren't. I mean, it's the craziest thing in the world. It's like, oh my word, this whole class of medical interventions was never, at least the ones we're taking now, are for the most part, if not entirely, fail this kind of gold standard test. Now, then when it's pointed out that, okay, why didn't you use a non-inert placebo? Why did you use like the previous edition of the vaccine? They said, well, it would be immoral and unethical to deprive the other group from getting the benefits of the vaccine. Well, that's not how these things work. And besides which, you're just doing the trial. Maybe it's over a couple of months. The idea that it would be putting people at too great a risk by giving them an inert placebo, it just doesn't pass the smell test. So I'd say that's probably the thing that just stuck in my mind. The two crazy things about this topic: one, that we granted them, vaccine manufacturers, liability, so that they can't be sued unless fraud's involved. And two, the crazy way in which the approval processes worked for the drugs that are on the current schedule. Those are the two craziest things I can tell you, Irina. When I tell people that, now you know that vaccine companies can't be sued if they injure someone, right? You know that. Reporters, ordinary people, even some doctors just dispute it. They don't say, oh, really? And they don't say, oh, that's no big deal. They say, that's outrageous, because they recognize that that would be a crazy thing to do. That's exactly what we do in this country. And so, again, the problem is not, oh, no, don't tell people that because they might be skeptical. The problem is that they did that. And so any rational person is going to probably be somewhat skeptical if they find out the truth.
Right. Are there any alternatives to aluminum as an adjuvant?
Yeah, and there's talk about that for sure. I mean, aluminum's almost certainly better than mercury, which is, even until recently, I think thimerosal was being used in some, sort of multi-dose flu vials. There probably are, but it's kind of a question. The problem is if the drug companies are doing really robust studies testing the safety of an aluminum adjuvant to others, it would be sort of conceding that it's a risk, right? And so at the moment, that's where we are. But this is the problem, is that because the market is so bizarrely distorted, the very kinds of research questions that could answer, or research that could answer these questions don't get done because they don't have to be done, or people are afraid it would sort of lead to skepticism. But I mean, I can tell you for myself that I think the risk to the aluminum adjuvant is its own question, and that the fact that we ingest certain kinds of aluminum, and maybe in larger doses than we would receive in a vaccine, it's completely irrelevant because they're different forms of aluminum. And as long as you don't have a leaky gut, you're going to get rid of that. Your kidneys are going to filter it out. That's different than when you inject it directly into a muscle, and the kinds of things that can do. And I know there's one study with animal models, the result of which suggested that actually the lower dose within a range of an injection with aluminum, the higher risk it is, but until you get, of course, way, way down. And the reason is because if it's low enough, your body doesn't even mount an immune response. And so you can build this stuff up in your system, and your body's not even sort of having an immune response. And so it doesn't know that it needs to get rid of this stuff. So there's all sorts of complications like this. We treat the human body and immune system like it's a simple bag of chemicals that we understand. And the immune system is extraordinarily complex, and there's lots of things we just don't understand. And so we should always approach it with humility and say, okay, even if this is beneficial under these certain circumstances, all things being equal, it's probably doing some things we don't know. So let's really keep an eye on it and be careful to study it even after it's approved, as opposed to just, sort of moving along.
Right, and of course, children have different thresholds of how much aluminum they can have in
Yeah.
their bodies, and I also learned that children actually can't their bodies can't actually detox until,
No.
what is it, age 10? So even their bodies react to this differently, and the detoxification process, as you mentioned, your body does detox these things, but for children, it's actually very different.
Kids are small too, and of course, by definition, their immune systems are not as developed. They hadn't had encountered as many pathogens, and so it's really serious business.
Right. You were talking about the fact that these pharmaceutical companies get away and they have no liability. Is that the case for other drugs, or is it just for vaccines?
No, this is the only. So at the moment, I think that there are immunity from liability from certain kinds of things, but and the other examples that I've been able to find mostly make perfect sense, and if I explained them, they would make sense. I believe at the moment, vaccines, so that class of drugs, right? So vaccines is a subset. In fact, in many cases, drugs and vaccines are distinguished. So vaccine's not even called a drug. And so vaccines, defined in a certain way under the original 1986 Act, are basically protected. So if you do what you're supposed to do and you don't commit fraud, you release that. These are intrinsically unsafe. They're, unavoidably unsafe, as I think how it's talked about in tort law. And so there's like an intrinsic risk to this product, and companies say, well, we may not be able to produce these and offer it because we don't want to get sued unless you give us this liability protection, which is why it was done in 1986. But they're protected for this one thing. But we don't do it for food. We don't do it for water. We don't do it for the electricity in people's homes. All of these are very important. We don't do it for other kinds of drugs, right? There's all sorts of hundreds and hundreds of drugs out there that don't receive this protection. And so that suggests it's a very strange thing. Now, there are some folks that are trying to introduce the same kind of liability shield for pesticides right now here in Washington. And I think we've foiled the effort in a couple of cases, but lobbyists are very clever, and so they're trying to move it around and get it to show up in some bill, maybe that Congress doesn't notice. And so if they succeeded, then certain kinds of pesticides would also have this. But at the moment, it's vaccines specifically that have this kind of liability protection, even though we would recognize that's crazy. Let's say for fast food. So let's say for fast food companies, if they're too worried about getting sued, then they won't produce hamburgers, and we need food, so let's protect them from liability. Well, okay, if you knew that a restaurant had a legal protection and so you couldn't sue that restaurant if it gave you severe illness, you're not going to eat at that restaurant, right? And so you want it for the whole industry so that you really don't have a choice if you want to eat. We recognize how crazy it is. If we did this to cars, right? You recognize that just completely scrambles natural market
Mhm.
incentives that you want to be in place. But we do it for vaccines. And so anyone that really realizes the truth of this and then understands enough economics to see what that's going to set up, I think is perfectly rational in being concerned about the schedule as a whole.
Right, and I mean, there's recalls for everything, for foods that have listeria, bacteria, whatever, for cars, for car seats, there's
Yeah.
recalls. But again, you said the vaccine industry, the pharmaceutical industry, especially as it relates to vaccines, just gets a free pass
Yeah, I
with
mean, they do,
steroids.
of course, vaccines, dangerous vaccines where the signal is sort of obvious, and up front, do get pulled and have for decades, in which a vaccine will go on the market. In fact, this is true with early polio vaccines, and then get pulled. But there's this kind of a strong disincentive to that, and it's very hard if a vaccine has a kind of long-term or chronic effect that you don't see right away, so you don't even recognize even the signal. But think about it, like, say, with respect to antibiotics, so which are wonderful if properly used, saved hundreds of millions of lives, including my own. But if your child takes a vaccine, I mean, an antibiotic for something, maybe an ear infection, and she breaks out in hives and itches and is coughing and her lips swell up, and you tell the doctor, well, right when she started taking the antibiotics, she got this reaction. The doctor doesn't say, well, correlation isn't causation, it's probably just a coincidence. They immediately stop that antibiotic and try another one, right? And of course, the logical point's true. It's just a correlation as a proof causation. But in real life, if you do something, an intervention, you get a severe reaction, you assume all things being equal that there's causation and you act. But it's like you're not allowed to do this for the most part when it comes to vaccines until there's a kind of a preponderance of the evidence and the signal is strong enough that it just becomes too hard to ignore.
Mhm. I want to pivot now to ethics,
Mm,
and just to talk a little bit about some of the ethical issues involved with vaccines. So, from an ethical standpoint, what does real informed consent look like in
yeah.
childhood vaccination? And where do parents most often feel that consent breaks down?
Well, there's two words there, right? So informed means, in other words, that a person has to have access to and awareness of the relevant information needed to make a rational decision. So the clear numeric risks, real comparisons, I'd say absolute risks as opposed to relative risks. So what that means is, so let's say somebody says, you need to get this, if you don't get this shot, you are twice as likely to die of this disease as if you get it. And you say, okay, so how common is death for people that aren't, sort of vaccinated for this disease? They say, well, in the general population, it would be like 2 in a million. And if you get this shot, it will be 1 in a million, right? Okay, well, but the risk is so low in absolute terms that it's not the same. But the doctor could tell you it's right. It's twice as likely that you're going to die of this if you don't get the shot. That's true, but it's so unlikely and so infrequent that it doesn't make sense. So you really want to know what are these are absolute versus relative risks so you can make that decision. What are the uncertainties? What are the alternatives? What is the kind of relevant moral information, like we talked about, sort of fetal cell line questions and the way it was developed? There's other ways. There'd be other questions like, was this tested on a population that didn't know that they were receiving the test or were part of the test, right? But there's these kind of background ethical questions that are really kind of separate from the choice itself. And then it needs to be in a context of unhurried dialogue. So in other words, if somebody, your physician or practitioner, wanted to assure you that you were well informed, that he or she is going to take the time to explain it or to send you to resources that could explain it as non-propagandistic resources that are genuine and describing the costs and benefits. And so we all have to do this, right, in almost any circumstance. And so there's no absolute advice about, okay, when have you reached informed consent? But I would say at least those. Has the person that wants you to do this given you the numerical risks? Do you know the difference between informed and relative risk? Do you know the uncertainties? Do you know the alternatives? Do you have the kind of background information about the moral issues involved in the study? And were you given an opportunity to have this explained to you rather than hurried along and dismissed? And notice in that case, even if you don't feel like, okay, still I'm not an expert, don't know that I understand it, but if you just been given those things in a reasonable way, I think you could feel much more comfortable than if you haven't. And whereas if you're hurried along or dismissed and don't really have a sense of this and are consigned to sort of pull down the explanatory sheet at the CDC website, it's just reasonable that you're going to be more skeptical.
Mhm. So you mentioned some vaccines are tested on aborted fetal cell lines. Which are the vaccines that carry distinct moral weight, such as those that I mentioned that are connected to aborted fetal cell lines?
Mhm.
And how does Catholic teaching specifically help parents assess those vaccines?
Yeah, and so it's hard to answer simply, though I do send people to the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which keeps a sort of a running sort of document describing the different kinds of vaccines, the different brands, and then the way they're implicated. And so sort of to put it sort of simply, you can have a situation where maybe one of the trials for a drug, and so we'll just talk about vaccines though. So one of the trials might have used a fetal cell line, so not literal fetal tissue, but fetal cell line. In other words, it originated from the cells of an aborted human fetus that is then replicated. So it's a kind of ongoing cell line, and then maybe it's one of the trials. It's tested using those fetal cells or cell line. But there are other tests that confirm the finding, right? So in other words, it's not uniquely dependent upon this particular evil. And then, of course, in Catholic teaching, and really, I mean, I think this is just really good ethical reasoning in general. It's just that it's really richly developed in the Catholic tradition. You have formal and material cooperation, and then you have proximate and remote cooperation. So proximate would be that you're right, it's really close to it, and then material, maybe you're incidentally participating in an evil, but you're not endorsing it. And so all of those questions come into play. So that sort of long story short, a scenario in which, let's say, you're at extremely high risk, your child is at extremely high risk of death or serious disease for not receiving a particular treatment. And there's a sort of ethical pathway in the way it was developed, even if there are also unethical ways. That's almost certainly going to be remote, very much remote cooperation. So the idea is that you're cooperating with an evil in the sense that your action is dependent upon, at some distance, an unethical action, but you're not cooperating with it in a sense that would be severely morally problematic. And so it's hard to commit to memory what those are, but Charlotte Lozier and a few other organizations that do a really good job of just helping you through that. So as a parent and as an adult, if you want to avoid as much implication with those kinds of things as possible, then folks should have a look at that. And then the other thing is that if enough people, Americans and parents in particular, object to certain kinds of drug testing and development, that eventually creates a market signal. If people are asking, I want the details of this particular flu shot you're going to give me or whatever. And so we need to create enough of a market signal that the private corporations will have an incentive to find more ethical ways of testing the products that they develop.
Sure. And more specifically, for example, the MMR,
Yeah.
that's one of the vaccines that's implicated that was tested on aborted fetal cell lines. So
Yeah.
people who have moral qualms about that, obviously the cooperation is not direct,
Hmm.
but at least from the church's teaching, the Catholic Church's teaching, is that you make your objections known in
That's
a letter publicly, because that's the only option for an MMR in the U.S.
yeah.
But we also know that Japan has developed an MMR that is not ethically tainted.
Yeah. That's right.
So why is it not available in America? More
It's
people need to object to the fact that we don't have alternatives when there are alternatives available, correct?
Absolutely. That's
Right.
exactly right, and it's for basic economic reasons, and so that's why over and over I say, "Okay, we need to do things to change the economic incentives." And if a large enough percentage of the population just says, "I'm not gonna do that as long as it was tested that way. You guys need to come up with a different way of testing and approving this drug," there'll be an incentive. There'll be an economic incentive for companies to do that.
Right. So, from a bioethical perspective, how do we balance protecting children from serious disease while also respecting their developing bodies and individual circumstances?
So I would say it's all about sort of combining proper benefit with autonomy. And so, of course, a child lacks basically all autonomy. A newborn, right, can't walk, doesn't really know how to communicate except to let you know that something's wrong. And so, when we first receive our children, they're entirely dependent upon us, and we are basically acting on their behalf entirely. Right. But if any parent knows that, of course, what you want to do is you want to have this kind of increasing cone of responsibility and autonomy in which you give a child, just enough to be able to develop his or her own capacities and agency, but not so much that your child either doesn't learn the lessons that he or she ought to, or ends up, injuring himself because it was a ridiculous risk. And so that, by the time they're 18 or 20 or 32, it seems to be the current age, right? They will be a sort of fully formed adult that's able to make their own informed decisions. And so their proper autonomy. Now, autonomy is a kind of abstract ideal. It's not anything anyone wants. We're not isolated individual monads that have no responsibilities for either ourselves or for each other. By autonomy, I just mean the ability of self-rule, so that you're able to make decisions and govern yourself and the things that you do. And so that's what. But the problem with like the CDC vaccination schedule is almost all of those things. Those are decisions of the parents in which we're making decisions on behalf of our children. And so that's why basically what you want to ask, I really don't think it's at all appropriate that a parent should have to subject his or her child to a risk for a thing that gives that child little or no benefit for the benefit of someone else. That's essentially applying a kind of bizarre utilitarian calculus to your child. There should be benefit to your child, and you should be satisfied that the benefit exceeds the risk for your child. You shouldn't be psychologically pressured and blackmailed into saying you got to give this thing to your child because somebody else somewhere that you don't know might theoretically benefit from it. That's way too vaporous. Your primary responsibility is the well-being of your child in that decision. And it helps probably to know that the routine vaccines are actually less effective at genuinely preventing transmission than most people think they are. So it's actually a less difficult moral decision than you might think it is otherwise. I think it's just basically think about the risk reward for your individual child and make the decision on that, and don't be buffaloed into some claim of sort of benefit to the common good or something like that, which I don't, for the most part, I don't think applies when you're making the decision on behalf of your child. It might be different when you're making the decision on behalf of yourself as an adult.
Hmm. From an ethical and constitutional perspective, how should we think about religious liberty
Mm.
in the context of vaccine requirements?
So it's funny because I've got a piece that I wrote a couple of months ago, and it's basically how to mount a religious liberty objection to vaccine mandates. And so I think that the problem becomes acute if vaccines are just, oh, these can be beneficial. Here's the cost. Here's the benefits. Would you like to receive it? Right? That's kind of low pressure thing and maybe not all that significant, except, yeah, you might, but you can decide, right, one or the other. On the other hand, given everything we've talked about, and you're having to decide to give a vaccine to your child, that raises the stakes dramatically. And it's, I think, much easier to have a religious liberty objection in that case, precisely because you have this custodial relationship with your child. And so it's inappropriate to decide I'm going to put my child at risk for some kind of putative social benefit. And I think God told me to protect my children, right? In fact, it's in the catechism. It's in the Catholic catechism that we have responsibility for the well-being of our children. And if let's say I'm going to use the hepatitis B vaccine, which is the one I used in the document, I have a religious liberty to giving my day old child or anyone else's child, or my grandchild if I were responsible for the hepatitis B vaccine on day one, because I know what trial led to its approval. If I recall correctly, it was 147 subjects followed for 5 days, something like that, and it wasn't tested on brand new newborns. Especially if I know the mother is hepatitis B negative, child at very low risk of getting the disease. There's all sorts of unknown risks, and I do not have any confidence in that trial. And so I would be unjustly putting my child at risk for a benefit that doesn't even exist for my child. And so I object to this. That's a straightforward religious liberty objection to a mandate for a particular vaccine. And I think if it ever reached the Supreme Court, it would be quite compelling. Now, having said that, there's a famous case called Jacobson. I think it's in 1905. It involved a case in which a man I think it was Cambridge, Massachusetts, this Jacobson, um, basically objected to getting a smallpox vaccine based on his individual autonomy. He just is basically, my constitutional right as an individual is violated by receiving this vaccine. Now, here are the circumstance. It was the middle of a smallpox epidemic. It's extremely infectious and easily spread. It was something like a third of people at the time that got smallpox died. And the fine for not receiving the vaccine was something like $5. And so it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, okay, the city of Cambridge, I may be getting the city wrong, but whatever it is, has a legitimate interest in mandating the smallpox vaccine under these particular circumstances. And so people take that to mean that the Supreme Court has decided that it's constitutional to just mandate any and all vaccines. which is absurd. It was a very particular case, very particular facts and circumstances at the time, and is just virtually unrelated to these questions about most of the things on the CDC vaccination schedule. At the moment, if I'm not mistaken, the court has never taken up the question of vaccine mandates for the vaccines that we're talking about now and religious liberty. So notice Jacobson appealed just to his individual liberty and autonomy. He didn't appeal to his religious liberty. And religious liberty, I think, in this context, especially if you're making the decision for a young child, it's a much, much stronger sort of foundation on which to make this. I do hope actually that the Supreme Court eventually takes it up. I just hope that they don't take it up until it's widely enough known what the facts and the details of the current CDC vaccination schedule are. Because my worry, I mean, the court, like it or not, is a cultural institution. And so if the court is a majority of the courts still believes sort of the propaganda that they see on CNN or something about this, right, then they might dismiss it. But if they understand the sort of factual basis of and the details of the risks and rewards of these vaccines, I think they're almost certainly likely, at least for a lot of vaccines, to rule in favor, of the religious liberty rather than the benefit of the state to compulsion. But that's still it's a legal test that still has to be worked out. But as long as you frame it properly, I think there is a really good and a prima facie case that can be made for religious liberty involving your children, at least for some of the vaccines.
Right. I think that so this has a personal meaning to me
Right.
because, we live in the Archdiocese of Washington,
Uh-huh.
and it's crazy to me that if we wanted to get an exemption for any vaccine for our son,
Huh.
the Archdiocese of Washington does not allow religious exemptions. This is a Catholic
Yes.
archdiocese in
Yes.
the US,
That's
will
right.
not allow a religious exemption for any vaccine except a temporary medical exemption. But if our son went to public school in our state, you can get a religious exemption for vaccines. So in a
Yeah.
public school, you can get a religious
Yes.
exemption, but in the Archdiocese of Washington, a Catholic
That's
archdiocese,
right.
this is not allowed. And so it's interesting what the implications are here. And
Mhm.
really, a lot of people have complained. A lot of Catholics have complained about this in the Archdiocese of Washington. They
Absolutely.
haven't done anything about it.
No.
Um,
Perfect example, just like the Supreme Court, the bishops and the bishops conference is also a cultural institution. On the margins, they're going to make the right choice, but when it comes to these things on which they haven't done a lot of reflecting, they're just as likely as anyone else to sort of believe the conventional wisdom. It's so sad that the state of Maryland, the deep blue state of Maryland, will give you a religious exemption from vaccines involving your children, but the Archdiocese of Washington, which includes a portion of Maryland, will not do it. It's an absolutely ridiculous scenario. I'm hopeful that that will eventually be changed, but it's going to take some serious educating, I think, of the bishops before they realize that this is a serious problem.
Right. And I think what's going to help change this is actually the new CDC schedule
Huh.
update for the childhood immunization schedule. So let's talk about that a little bit. In
Yeah.
early January, HHS/CDC updated the childhood immunization schedule. What prompted this?
Well, what prompted it is, of course, essentially the choice. I mean, the remote cause of this was Donald Trump being elected in 2024 and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. having allied himself in August of 2024 with Donald Trump, and then President Trump, nominated Kennedy to become the HHS secretary. He became the secretary, and then we have amazing people like Jay Bhattacharya at NIH. We have Marty Makary, of course, at FDA, and many other sort of government officials now that are looking into this. And so I think there's an executive order. There's a requirement to look at the vaccine schedules of other countries. Presumably, Northern Europe and European countries are not just completely clueless and are also capable of conducting and understanding studies. And it turns out ours are just much more draconian. I mean, tend to be much more coercive. We tend to require more vaccines at earlier ages. People didn't really know that, and so they sort of undertook an investigation and comparison, and so we have this new three-tier framework in which they sort of at the CDC they basically designate different vaccines in different categories, and so there's routine vaccines, there's high-risk vaccines, and there's ones that ought to be subject to what's called shared decision making, which just means okay, so this is a vaccine that might have some benefits for your child, but the decision should be one between you and your doctor effectively. It shouldn't be, the Archdiocese of Washington shouldn't be telling you which ones to get. The CDC shouldn't be telling you. The state shouldn't be telling you. Your local public school shouldn't be telling you. It should be up to you and your physician or your child's physician. Now, my view, it should all be shared decision making, and unless maybe there's some extreme example you could imagine. But if it's not shared decision making, how can you exercise informed consent? Right? And so it's in some ways this alerts you to the fact that you only get to have shared decision making for a few of them. Still, when you're dealing with policies and rules and regulations in Washington, you praise directional improvement, and this is vast directional improvement. So I think the routine vaccines got reduced from 17 to 11 in terms of total number, and then others are sort of designated as shared decision making, COVID and some others. And I think it's no longer recommended that you do the first dose of hepatitis B on day one. Again, it's still, from my view, fairly modest, but it's a really important directional change. And I'm an incrementalist. That's the way to go. And so basically, presidential memos that compare U.S. to other peer nations. Result, we changed this up, made it less coercive, at least at the margins. And the goal was to align our schedule with international evidence and also to help restore credibility, because the administration recognizes the profound loss of trust that Americans have in our public health bureaucracy. And so it's admitting genuine pluralism, that the answer might be different for some parents than for others, and it shouldn't just be this kind of everybody has to do the same thing or they're an anti-vaxxer.
Hmm. What, if you can speak specifically, if you know, what was
Mhm.
removed or recategorized? I know that you said that the
Yeah,
hepatitis B was moved to later. Were there any that were removed or recategorized?
yeah, it's great. And so I don't have these committed to memory, but I found the information at the CDC. So it's basically moved out of routine or influenza, so flu shot. And so remember, we're talking about kids here. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, rotavirus, uh, meningococcal. So this is like for meningitis, and then COVID-19. So the different ones. I'm trying to remember. They're either high risk or shared decision making, but the kind of obvious one, COVID-19 and the hepatitis B, those are the sort of biggies. I mean, in my view, once you admit that these were poorly categorized and that other countries do it differently, that's the thread on this. And so that's why I think even the most modest improvement is a really good thing. Just as in the pediatric gender medicine fight that we've been involved in for years, any directional improvement is something to be happy about. So I look at this as a kind of a first positive step, but I think a lot more needs to be done. I just think shared decision making should be the rule all around.
Hmm. How did the international comparisons, once they did this review, how did those comparisons influence the decision? What do we know about specifically what other countries do
Yeah.
concerning vaccine schedules?
Well, so the COVID one, for instance, so Europe is much more likely. I mean, most of us, if you were trying to travel to Europe and even managing to do it during 2020 or 2021, certain European countries seem just utterly draconian. And if you're traveling, say, from Florida to some Western European country, except for Sweden, you felt like a police state even more over there than over here. But ironically, Europe was much quicker at realizing, okay, it doesn't make any sense to give everyone the COVID-19 vaccine or shot, because there's such a difference in risk. It's something like 1,000-fold difference between young children and teenagers and elderly people. And so it just doesn't make sense. And so they very quickly realized there's no reason to give this in a routine way to young and healthy kids. And so they focused on the sort of high risk group. Now, that also makes sense because there's only so much of this thing to go around, and so you want to triage who you give this to. On the other hand, if you want to force everybody to have to do it because there's a strong economic and social incentive, as there is here, it's going to go differently. And I hate to say it as a person who has spent decades now defending the free economy against the command economy. There is a sort of ironic benefit to the more centralized European health systems, in that they can sort of run this calculation. There's less of an economic incentive for them to spend, because effectively these interventions are being paid for with tax dollars. Where if you can sort of offload that to insurance companies and mandate it for them or something like that, then there's going to be an incentive to have more rather than fewer. It's the same thing with the pediatric gender medicine in the UK. There was one pediatric gender clinic called Tavistock, and they had the data to notice, oh wow, there's a vast uptick um, in diagnoses of pediatric gender dysphoria, especially among girls. In the US, at one point, we had 79 pediatric gender clinics, and almost all of the 600 or so Planned Parenthood clinics are dispensing cross-sex hormones. And so it's just kind of a free-for-all. And so that's a sort of irony that, a more centrally controlled, government-controlled healthcare system, it has some benefits. I'm not saying the benefits outweigh the costs. It's just that I think we're able to more quickly pivot away from this universal vaccine strategy with COVID than we have been. And then, the hepatitis B vaccine, for instance, is quite different. And then I think the key thing is that the mandate function of vaccines in many European countries is different. So in other words, there's very high uptake, so most people do what the sort of official government guidance is in many European countries, but it's also far less coercive. And so, that's interesting. It's also an interesting data point that it may be that mandates are making more and more people more and more skeptical and more resistant. And so I honestly think just opening this up and making it much more voluntary, respecting informed consent, could very well over time help people trust the system more. And also, I think if we remove the crazy liability shield that has protected vaccine companies all these decades, that will incentivize the drug companies to make their vaccines as safe and effective as possible. But I think if those things don't get done, there's just going to be more and more increased skepticism and resistance.
Yeah, my takeaway from this update is that in the European countries, you have less vaccines and you still have the same benefits. Whereas in the US, there's more mandates for more vaccines, and we're not really seeing the benefit of that. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of irony. And then we haven't said anything, it's so complicated, but, there are also downsides apart from the kinda actual risks of an adverse event with a vaccine. There's also some evidence that, for instance, in some cases, it may be that getting a natural disease, like, as long as you're healthy and are not vitamin A deficient, it may be that it's beneficial for other reasons to have gotten the measles when you were a kid to get the measles vaccine. There's lots of sort of examples of that, but a lot of it's sort of open questions. And then there's the question of, okay, something is happening that is causing a massive spike, especially among adolescents and young adults, of autoimmune disorders just all over the place. Well, we don't know for sure that that's directly being caused by adding more and more vaccines to the vaccine schedule, but it's not illogical to say, okay, we really need to test that because maybe this thing we're doing in which we're constantly perturbing children's immune systems in artificial ways, so in ways that we were not sort of designed to respond to. That's right. Remember, vaccine is artificial. It's not the way this was done in human history. That there might be kind of all sorts of negative consequences upstream that we don't even understand. But a lot of these questions that can't even be asked, and it'd be impossible to do the study unless you're independently wealthy, and also virtually impossible to get published in a reputable journal. And it's all because of the distortions of this market. And so it's once you kind of dig into it, you just realize, gosh, it's just crazy. This is not how a market should work. This is not how it should work in our country, which prizes freedom and liberty and consent. And this has to change.
Mhm. So, in most areas of medicine, we individualize care.
Mhm.
Why has vaccination historically been more one size fits all, even as the schedule expanded? Is this because of the liability protection on the pharmaceutical companies or something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's some of it is sort of convenience, right? And so if you systematize it like that, even we talk about a schedule, right? And if somebody has a newborn and they follow the schedule, they'll have this 1 month and 2 month and 3 month well visit. So in other words, you don't do this anywhere else where it's like every month I'm going to go to the doctor just in case there's something wrong. You go because of the vaccine schedule, right? And then so it's to try to get us sort of in routine. So again, this is the logic of public health rather than individualized Hippocratic medicine is you need people to act in a kind of universal way. There's also the argument of herd immunity. The sort of ideal for a vaccination strategy is that if you immunize enough of a population so that members of that population can either be infected or transmit the infection, right? If that really does that, so it's basically a sterilizing vaccine. And then you reach a percentage of the population. This is a kind of theoretical idea in which the thing just disappears. So in other words, 100% of the population wouldn't have to receive this kind of vaccine. but let's say it's 90% or 75%. And once you reach that, then there's just so few sort of places for the pathogen to go that it eventually disappears. This is the kind of thing that's happened in the US, I assume, with smallpox and polio will have incidents, but it's usually somebody that comes from another country. And so the argument is that, okay, well, in order to achieve herd immunity, lots of people need to do this. And so the incentive is to get as many people to do it as possible, as opposed to, oh no, we should use informed consent and have every patient get informed and then decide for him or herself or for the children or whatever. That's the kind of difficulty. And then, as you mentioned, the liability shield, once that went in, I mean, I think lots of people have seen on social media what the vaccine schedule looked like in 1985 and what it looked like in 2025, right? In which you've got a bunch more shots just all over the place. Guess what? Almost all of that happened after the liability shield was put in place. So in other words, once companies had an incentive to get something designated as a vaccine and to manufacture one, then it gets mandated. And then under the Affordable Care Act, insurance is mandated to cover these. I mean, it's an incredible gravy train. Imagine you can produce a product, and as long as you get it, federal government designates it to qualify in this certain way, the federal government will protect so you can't be sued, and it will make insurance companies pay for it for people. So there's going to be a third party payer. Well, that's quite the gravy train if you can get on it. But I don't think that's beneficial to individual Americans. It's certainly not obviously beneficial to our health or to our medical freedom. And so
Mhm.
that's just the reality. So it's sort of a confluence of economic factors and public health factors. I just really think that public health as a sort of institutional area and as a set of institutions needs to be rethought from the ground up and reoriented so that it's much more consistent with Hippocratic medicine than it is at the moment.
Right. And I totally agree with you on that. And we will talk a little bit about how to regain trust in the public
Mm.
health system in a little bit. But some public health experts worry that these changes that were made to the vaccine schedule could cause confusion or reduce uptake. How do you respond to those concerns?
Well, I would want to ask people that say that to say what they mean. So what's confusing about it? I mean, it's up to the doctor should be explaining this to them. If they're confused, the doctor should clear that up. I mean, but imagine this sort of abstractly. Okay, even though maybe this is going to put people at risk, even though we're telling people to get medical interventions in injections into the body of their children, right? That might be unnecessary or might be risky, and they might not do if they had all the information. The social good is so important that it sort of overtakes that. And one of the social goods is that people comply. And so you want to simplify it. Well, what's the simplest thing? Just do whatever the doctor tells you to do and don't ask any questions. Okay, well, we can use that logic for all sorts of things. So we're going to put people at risk for some abstract sort of social good, even though it might not even be beneficial to them individually. And so we're going to simplify, and in other words, simplify and in some cases misrepresent the complexity, which would be the truth, because they might otherwise be confused. I mean, it's morally outrageous. It's also insulting that parents are basically incapable of doing cost benefit analyses if they're informed by their doctors. Look, if doctors can't inform ordinary patients of the risks and rewards of particular interventions, doctors shouldn't do that. I mean, they shouldn't be doing it. I mean, it's different, of course, at the margins in which you're dealing with someone in an emergency situation that can't consent, but informed consent of patients, that should just be the kind of base level standard that we absolutely need to meet if medicine is going to be ethical. And then, I know, and some people had heard, well, it's okay, it's going to be confusing. And then because it got dropped or redesignated on the schedule, now insurance won't cover it. That's not true, actually. They in the provision said that no, insurance companies will still cover these if you want them. It's just that some of these have been moved, say, to shared decision making, so that you don't have to do it, but if you do it, insurance will cover it. That's true with lots of things, right? You could get a cataract in your eye, but it's not very severe, and so you decide you're going to wait a little while. But if you do have to get surgery, your insurance very often cover it. This is the same thing. I mean, basically what they're saying is we want to keep the same old system we had all along and not have any changes. And I just don't think we should take those arguments seriously.
Right. And I think you make a really great point that really the public good can't supersede the personal good, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, there's benefits to vaccines, but there's also risks. And
That's right.
so parents choosing for their children should be able to make that cost benefit analysis, the risks and the
Mhm.
benefits for themselves, and not have to put the public good before the good of their own child,
That's
or
right.
even themselves. And
And
so I think that's a really important point.
it is, and that's a principle of subsidiarity, right? That responsibility, all things being equal, should be handled at the lowest level of jurisdiction where there is knowledge. And it's also just properly defining the common good. The common good can't be in violation of the goods of individuals and families and communities. I think it was John the 23rd that said a common good takes up all of these lower common goods into itself. And so I'm not one of these people that says there's only individual goods, there are no collective goods. No, there are. I mean, the reason we have a government is because it's a public good for people, and we benefit in some ways from it, and then it also costs us in some ways. The argument isn't just focus on your own well-being and not anyone else's. It's you've got to make sure that you're not sacrificing your child's individual well-being for the promise of some abstract social good, which is very often what's happening.
Mhm. Some critics argue that the process bypassed the usual advisory committee review. Should that affect public trust in these recommendations?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's be realistic. Most people have no idea how any of this stuff is decided, right? They have no idea what the rulemaking process is in Washington, D.C., and notice of for proposed comments and all this stuff, right? How exactly should this be done? Well, the problem is that the system by which this has been done was set up and is itself distorted. And so the ACIP committee, so this is the committee that sort of looks at these, that has some independence. If you looked at its composition until Secretary Kennedy came into his position, it was just obviously a bunch of industry interests. I mean, some people say industry shills. In other words, people that themselves benefit financially from the approval of certain vaccines. I mean, it is a shameless example of the kind of corrupt cronyism that has gripped the public health apparatus in Washington, D.C. for so long. So what happened is that a lot of those people got fired and replaced with people that are genuine experts and that have much fewer conflicts of interest than basically any previous composition of the committee. And then those things were done. It started with an executive order, but there was a review process. And then if you say, okay, well, this was rushed, okay, what was being looked at? Well, what was being looked at is what other European countries or what other countries in the world do. And presumably they, unless you think all the other countries are just banana republics, they also had a procedure in which they decided and if there's a general consensus among 15 or 20 different countries that's different from ours, we don't have any reason to think ours is a more robust process for approval or decisions on this than the other countries were. And so what happened is that the comparison just made it obvious that we had a bunch of things we were mandating that didn't need to be mandated. And so that's what happened. And so this wasn't, Bobby Kennedy didn't just come to the office one day and take out a dartboard and sort of decide what to do. And in fact, if you look at the individual cases, what you'll find is that they were extremely rational in the choices they made. I mean, again, um, hepatitis B shot the day your child is born, completely ridiculous. And the fact that it was on the schedule already, thank God it has been removed. But the fact that it was on the schedule shows how bad the process was by which drugs got put on in the first place. When I first studied the hepatitis B vaccine, I thought, well, this is crazy, but I mean, okay, this is probably, it's a weird outlier. Well, yeah, it's more obvious than some of the others, but unfortunately, that basic problem persists with other drugs that are on the schedule as well. That one's just really obvious because you can point out that if the mother is hepatitis B negative, the child's at virtually zero risk, and it just seems crazy that you'd be giving a child the shot the day that they're born.
Mhm. Now, moving forward, what long term metrics should we watch?
Huh.
Disease rates, uptake, outcomes to evaluate whether the new schedule is working as intended?
Well, basically, we need to watch outcomes. That doesn't mean watch CNN because, look, if 3 children somewhere get the measles who are vitamin A deficient, that doesn't mean there is a measles epidemic and everybody's at deadly risk. That's just silly. I'm just old enough to remember, when it was a routine for people to get the measles, even though there was a vaccine available. By the way, over 99% of measles deaths in the 20th century uh, disappeared between 1911 and I think about 1963 before the measles vaccine. actually went online. So virtually all measles deaths disappeared because of changes in sanitation and other medical interventions before you even got the vaccine. So just a little kind of a dose of reality on that. But we do want to track disease outcomes. So if there massive outbreaks, genuinely and properly defined, or is the severity of particular illness for kids, has that gone up or has it gone down? Of course, questions about what the alternatives are, what are the alternative treatments, is always going to be relevant. Then we'll want to study the uptake. Now, I think that at the moment, only a little bit is done, and so I'll be surprised if people that are skeptical already will be confident in the process. But I would think the more that public health officials tell the truth and so are trustworthy, the more people will be right to put their trust in them. If we want public health officials to be trusted, they need to act in trustworthy ways. I don't know why this is a controversial point, but they need to tell themselves that before they go to bed at night. And then we'll look at public trust trends, which would be sort of connected to the uptake. And then what I would want to know is like, is there responsiveness of the safety signal? So in other words, we really need to reform bears so that it's not just a kind of vague impression of a signal for injury, but it's much easier to like detect a signal right away if an intervention has a negative effect. And then I absolutely expect that we will get and should demand an objective, careful, large, properly designed study of vaccinated populations and unvaccinated populations. Everybody's maybe heard the story about this Henry Ford study that was done, but then was suppressed and so not published. This is not that complicated. It doesn't prove causation, but it's really the only way to get any kind of clear signal about the schedule as a whole. Even if all of those vaccines on the schedule had been robustly tested and approved and were very low risk for most people, it doesn't follow that the schedule as a whole is. I mean, we know this with other drugs. One psychiatric drug might benefit you, but you add two or three, and there's all these kind of contraindications and interactions that we don't understand. Well, multiply it to, what is it? Something like 25 different diseases that are being sort of immunized for over, say, a 72 shot regimen over 18 years. How do you test the safety of that whole thing, the cumulative safety signal of the entire schedule? The only way to get a grip on that is going to be, okay, we've got this population of Amish people over here that don't get any vaccines, and we've got these people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, all of whom, get their COVID shot every 5 weeks. And let's compare general health outcomes for them. In some ways, we can control that. So compare a rural community that's more or less vaccinated. So there's a lot of ways that the NIH could design a study like this. The fact that they have not wanted to do such a study, I think itself speaks volumes.
Hmm. And speaking of rebuilding trust in the public health system, what practical steps can be taken to rebuild and strengthen that trust? You mentioned truth telling, but
Yeah.
are there other steps that they can take?
Absolutely. I do think all the types of studies I just mentioned. I also think that coercion itself is the main problem. I think if people just felt like, okay, here's the information, here's what we know about it, here are the benefits, here's how this was approved, and so the cost and benefits are all there on a sort of form. It's up to you, right? I think that alone would make people much trust it much more. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that what made me initially skeptical of the COVID vaccine was nothing that I knew about it. It was that they were mandating for people that just had the illness. That's just suspicious. And so there was even a risk. Some of us now, I want to give a shout out to Catholic University, which, though totally compliant and sort of encouraged vaccines and things like that, also didn't mandate it, the COVID vaccine, for faculty and students, which I was super thankful for because I was on the faculty there. And many of us had COVID and didn't want to have to get the vaccine since we didn't know much about it. That was huge. But, if people are forcing you to do something that's supposedly for your own benefit and you're otherwise rational, so it's not like you're, having multiple personality disorder and can't exercise your, your discretion. If they're forcing you to do it, it's like I just doubt that this is beneficial to me because you should prove to me that it's beneficial and then I'll do it voluntarily. And so I really think the fact that we mandate these things and then misrepresent the truth, that's the lion's share of cause for the public health lack of trust. And then, we haven't talked about all the suspected adverse events that people talk about that are the result of these, like autism and increases in immune disorders. And in some ways, you don't need to answer those complicated questions to be able to be much more discerning and careful in sort of how you make these choices.
Is it possible to support vaccines while also supporting greater transparency, stronger safety monitoring, and informed consent?
Totally. You don't have to have a kind of abstract opposition to vaccines, especially, I mean, a vaccine, a substance that causes you to have an immune response that protects you from encounter with a particular disease or pathogen, right? If that's what a vaccine is, in principle, that could be a good thing. There's probably examples of that. I don't dispute that there are benefits to many vaccines and have benefited particular people. It's my dispute is that it's very hard to see when the benefits outweigh the risks in many cases. And in many cases, those benefits and risks have been misrepresented. In fact, if you're genuinely interested in people voluntarily taking vaccines you believe are beneficial, you should want more choice. You should want more informed consent rather than less. That's not only are those compatible, they're perfectly consistent. And I think one reinforces the other.
Mhm. Since you brought up autism and other adverse events, can you speak a little bit about that? Obviously, there's a section of people who do believe that there is either causation or an effect for autism from the vaccines. What is your take? What does your research show? And how should parents go about separating what's true from what's false?
Yeah, that's a great question because, I mean, of course, it is true that it's easy to associate one thing with another and incorrectly think that it has sort of causation. At the same time, we have thousands and thousands of parents, a few hundred of whom I've met, some of them who are professionals and are perfectly capable of, evaluating evidence, that told me, it says, well, my child or my twins were both progressing normally. I've got video of them at age 3 sort of acting normally, and then they got a particular vaccine, and very quickly one of my twins became nonverbal and has been severely autistic and is now an adult. I mean, severely autistic, so not, oh, kind of a little odd and awkward. I mean, like, nonverbal, stemming really strong kind of antisocial behavior and things like that. That's just rational. And so if you have enough people telling you that, saying, well, causation and correlation aren't the same thing, that's bizarre. What we should, yes, of course, but let's make darn sure that there's no causal signal here. And it may be that there's a causal signal and that it affects certain kids at a certain age, but not others. It may be that there's a combination of factors that are environmental and vaccine related that lead to this. Those are just, you don't need to know anything to think, okay, well, that should be a legitimate subject of search. But unfortunately, just like a lot of the claims about the placebo controlled trials for the vaccines on the schedule, there are all of these really ridiculous claims the media parrots. This has just been absolutely tested and studied and debunked. Not true. And in fact, usually when people tell you that, it's not true on almost any subject because the reality is scientists, especially if they're working for private companies, are really good at designing studies uh, and that are designed to look like they're testing the thing because they're after the naive media headlines, but in fact, it didn't quite test the thing that they're after. I'll give you a simple example. Another subject I follow closely is the USDA food guidelines and the benefits of different macronutrients and diets and things like that. And for a long time, I've been interested in the effects of a ketogenic diet, both for kind of health benefits, at least as a kind of a part-time strategy, but also as a therapeutic response for certain kinds of illness. And you can't imagine how many so-called studies to test the ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet has to be so low in carbohydrates that your body runs out of carbs and starts producing a bunch of ketones, which is this artificial fuel that your body can use rather than glucose. Okay. And so a ketogenic diet has to just have almost no carbohydrate, probably below 50 grams a day, maybe 20 grams for some people. And so if you're going to test the ketogenic diet against something, the most basic thing you have to do is make sure that group you're testing has extremely low carbohydrate consumption. You can't believe how many studies supposedly test this, but don't, right? They don't actually do it. It's like, okay, this group had slightly fewer carbohydrates or something. Well, that's what you would do if you wanted to create fake results, not that were fake themselves, but that were kind of a decoy so that people would think they had tested the thing when in fact they hadn't. Because most of what most people know about almost all these studies is from reading a single headline, and you can count on writers in the legacy media to, for the most part, just completely parrot whatever came off the press release from the company. The same thing, unfortunately, is true with a lot of these sort of these vaccine studies in which, okay, they studied something, it was even well designed, but in the abstract, but it didn't actually test the thing that we'd want to have tested. That's why I actually think this vaccinated versus unvaccinated study is so important, because at least it allows us to kind of get a grip. And I'm inclined, look, if hundreds of rational parents tell me, okay, my child changed immediately after this one thing that we did, parents are incredibly acutely aware of what's going on with their children. Mothers can tell exactly every day how, the mood that their child is in, just based on subtle little cues. So when you get a massive clue like that, we should not be gaslighting parents that have experienced this directly. We should be using it as an occasion to find out the truth.
Right, and there's obviously been cases where babies have died right after the next day after vaccine doses, etc. So, what kinds of studies should the government do? Should independent groups do to see what the effects are of vaccines and whether or not to kind of have a more conclusive answer as to whether or not these vaccines somehow cause autism, can cause death, can cause other problems. Obviously, we've talked about the benefits of vaccines, but what about looking at the risks more intently?
Yeah, I mean, it would require, first of all, genuine tests that are placebo controlled, and there's no reason we can't do that. Let's say for the next version of the measles, like let's isolate the measles, so it's not in the MMR, it's just measles, and we'll take whatever the next one up, next version up that gets approved. Don't tell me that, okay, you're putting children, a small set of children at risk for a few weeks because they don't get to have the real vaccine. They're going to get the placebo. That's just ridiculous, especially because it's not even going on for that long. Let's just do real comparisons between, right, a group that's getting the vaccine and a group that's getting a genuinely inert placebo. That is the simplest thing in the world, at least conceptually. And the objections to doing that, they're frankly ridiculous. And then again, the comparisons of vaccinated and unvaccinated groups, timing studies, for instance, on increases in, say, sudden infant death syndrome, and those would be this correlational, right, with the certain vaccines maybe going online. There's so many kinds of studies that could be done. The problem is that as long as we rely on the companies who profit from the vaccines to do the studies, there's always going to be this terrible conflict of interest. And so I will say, okay, so let's have NIH do it. Okay, yeah, in principle, except that can also be conflicts of interest because sometimes these are the same people. There are lots of employees of the NIH, for instance, that get royalties from drugs and vaccines that they have played a role in approving and developing. And so you need the study to be conducted by people that are genuinely independent of all of these industry interests. And just working for the government isn't enough. I think it can be guided by NIH, but they should have really specific strictures to avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest. And I'm excited that, Jay Bhattacharya at NIH has actually talked about doing many of these studies. I know he's a good person and is just a fine human being and a very smart scientist. And so he is the man in the country, honestly, that I'd want in charge of an operation like that. I'm just really hoping that we see some trials like this go online here in the next couple of years.
For parents who feel caught between trusting the system and trusting your instincts, what's the most important thing you want them to know?
The most important thing I'd want them to know is that they should not be gaslit out of their common sense, and they shouldn't be gaslit out of trusting their gut. If something feels wrong, if something feels like, okay, I don't feel like my doctor's telling me the truth. I asked my doctor a simple question, and she bit my head off and treated me like an idiot and didn't answer what should have been a simple question that I would assume a doctor would know. Just go with that, right? It doesn't mean never have your child get that vaccine or never trust medicine, right? It's like there's always the temptation to overcorrect. So notice I would never say, okay, yeah, the public health bureaucracies, especially in this country, they lied to us during COVID. Sometimes I think intentionally, and in many cases since then, they misinform us, even if they mean well. They're misrepresenting the truth. I don't take that to mean, therefore, don't trust anyone, right? That's the black pill option, and that doesn't make sense. Just because some people are untrustworthy some of the time doesn't mean there aren't other people that are trustworthy as well. We need to all do more to figure out, okay, is this person, is this institution worthy of my trust? And you can certainly stress test that simply by asking what should be routine questions that you should rightly expect a physician or a practitioner or a high school administrator to know the answers to. And so if somebody's forcing you to do something and then you want just a few basic details and they don't seem to want to answer you, you are right to be suspicious. But I think parents have been pressured over decades to feel like, okay, they're not smart enough, they're putting their children at risk, and they should just trust the experts. And I honestly think that we need more common sense. We need to trust our guts more, but make sure that your gut is also informed. Take the time, if you're really passionate about this, take the time to read some of the books on this subject. There's lots of really good books that can help you as a parent get, at least the basic foundation to these things. You don't have to become an expert, but I honestly think if you know the right kinds of resources within a few months, you can learn enough to be able to really exercise informed consent with these questions.
And we will certainly link to different resources on the episode page. The last question is, if you had one takeaway message for our listeners about vaccines, about vaccine decision-making, informed consent, etc., what would that message be, Jay?
It'd be this. Here is the golden mean and the ideal: informed discernment. So in other words, exercise discernment, trust what ought to be trusted, distrust what ought not to be trusted, right? That's the discernment. But to know the answers to that rationally, you're going to have to be grounded in the evidence insofar as you can sort of study the evidence. Part of the evidence is just the transparency and the apparent honesty of the people that ought to be experts. I'm not saying never trust an expert for anything, but if the experts seem like they won't square with you, that's evidence that something's wrong. Even if you don't know how a drug was approved, right, or a vaccine was approved, but the authorities that are supposed to know the answers to these questions brush you off, that is evidence that something is up, right? And you're right to feel sort of troubled. And remember that, we live at a time in history in which we have all sorts of kind of medical interventions and all sorts of ways of treating illness in which people, in principle, we all have access to nutritious food. None of us should be malnourished. Now, we are, but for different reasons, right? Because of junk food and things like that. But this isn't 1700, in which there are very few options. And the truth of the matter is that many, many diseases that plagued humans for all of history, we've gotten rid of, and we've gotten rid of because of different therapies, because of clean water and food and refrigeration and hygiene, quite apart from these questions of vaccines. And so don't imagine that you're sort of rejecting all of modern medicine if you're skeptical about giving your child the COVID vaccine or something. You're not. You're just being discerning. So do your best to exercise informed discernment.
Well, thank you so much, Jay, for sharing your knowledge and expertise on this topic. And of course, you have knowledge and expertise on so many topics, but hopefully this is a help to parents and policymakers, decision makers about how to navigate questions about vaccines. So thank you again.
So good to be with you, Arena.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.